By October 2011, one of history's most ruthless dictators was hiding like a cornered animal in a drainage pipe. Muammar Gaddafi, the man who had terrorized Libya for 4 decades, was about to face the most savage end imaginable. What happened in those final hours was so brutal, so shocking that it would send shockwaves across the world. This is the untold story of his last moments, and I'm warning you right now, what you're about to hear will haunt you. If you think you can handle the truth about one of history's most violent endings, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Fleek of History brings you the stories they don't want you to know. The rise of a monster in 1942. Deep in Libya's unforgiving desert, a child was born who would grow up to become one of Africa's most feared tyrants. Muammar Gaddafi emerged from poverty, but his hunger for power was insatiable. At just 27, this ambitious young officer orchestrated a bloodless coup that would plunge Libya into 4 decades of terror. Gaddafi didn't just seize power, he crushed every trace of opposition beneath his boot. He dismantled the monarchy, expelled foreign military bases, and turned Libya's oil wealth into his personal piggy bank. His so-called Jamahiriya system was nothing but a sick joke, power to the people while he held every string. The 1970s and 80s revealed Gaddafi's true face to the world. This wasn't just a dictator, he was a sponsor of international terror. His fingerprints were all over deadly attacks across the globe, including the horrific Pan Am Flight 103 bombing that murdered 270 innocent people over Lockerbie. While families mourned their dead, Gaddafi celebrated in his golden palaces. Inside Libya, people lived in fear. Speaking against the regime meant torture, disappearance, or death. The oil money that should have lifted every Libyan out of poverty instead lined the pockets of Gaddafi's corrupt inner circle, while ordinary families struggled to survive. The storm breaks when February 2011 arrived. The fury that had been building for decades finally exploded. The Arab Spring had already toppled dictators in Tunisia and Egypt, and now it was Libya's turn. What started as a small protest outside a police station in Benghazi quickly became a raging inferno of rebellion. February 15th marked the beginning of the end. Families of political prisoners gathered to demand justice. They wanted the release of human rights lawyer Fatih Terbil, arrested for speaking about the Abu Salim prison massacre, where over 200 prisoners were systematically slaughtered by Gaddafi's death squads in 1996. By February 17th, the day of rage, the streets of Benghazi, Baida, Tobruk, and Derna flooded with tens of thousands of Libyans who had finally reached their breaking point. They weren't just protesting, they were roaring for freedom after 4 decades of suffocation. Gaddafi's response was pure evil. Instead of listening to his people's cries for dignity, he unleashed hell. His security forces opened fire on unarmed civilians with live ammunition. Snipers positioned on rooftops hunted protesters like prey. Within 4 days, over 230 people lay dead in the streets, shot down like dogs for daring to dream of freedom. The revolution ignites by late February. Something unprecedented happened. Gaddafi's own military began defecting. Soldiers who had sworn loyalty to the regime looked at the bodies of innocent civilians and said no more. The 36th Brigade turned their guns on their former master and helped rebels seize Benghazi. The revolution spread like wildfire. Cities across eastern Libya broke free from Gaddafi's stranglehold. Even Gaddafi's Air Force pilots refused to bomb their own people, flying their jets to Malta rather than murder civilians. The rebels organized into the National Transitional Council. For the first time in decades, Libyans had leaders who represented hope instead of fear. Meanwhile, Gaddafi clung to Tripoli with his most loyal forces and foreign mercenaries from Chad, Mali, and Niger who had no problem killing for money. The world intervenes. By March 2011. The situation had reached a horrifying climax. Gaddafi's forces were using tanks, artillery, and warplanes to massacre civilians. The images coming out of Libya were apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, hospitals bombed, schools destroyed. On March 17th, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilians. 2 days later, the skies over Libya erupted in flames as coalition forces launched Operation Odyssey Dawn. Over 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles screamed toward Gaddafi's military infrastructure. NATO took command on March 23rd under Operation Unified Protector. For months, coalition aircraft pounded Gaddafi's forces relentlessly. Every tank, every weapons depot, every command center became a target. But the dictator remained defiant, appearing on state television to rant about Western colonialism while calling his own people rats and traitors. The fall of Tripoli, August 20th, 2011, Operation Mermaid Dawn began. Rebels launched their final assault on Tripoli in a coordinated attack that had been months in the planning. For 5 days, Tripoli became a war zone. Neighborhoods that had been silent under Gaddafi's oppression exploded with gunfire and explosions. On August 23rd, the rebels achieved the impossible. They overran Bab al-Azizia, Gaddafi's fortress in central Tripoli. For over 4 decades, this compound had been the symbol of absolute power in Libya. Now it lay in rebel hands, ransacked and burning, but Gaddafi himself had vanished like smoke. His family scattered to the winds. His wife, daughter, and 2 sons fled to Algeria, while another son escaped to Niger. But Gaddafi himself made a fateful decision that would seal his doom. The last stand instead of fleeing the country like his family, Gaddafi chose to make his final stand in Sirte, his hometown on the Mediterranean coast. Sirte held deep symbolic meaning for him. He had transformed it from a small coastal town into a modern city with gleaming buildings and wide boulevards. The National Transitional Council forces surrounded Sirte like a noose tightening around a condemned man's neck. Thousands of fighters from Misrata, Benghazi, and Zintan closed in from all directions. They expected quick victory, but Sirte proved to be a death trap. Gaddafi's remaining forces had turned the city into a fortress of hell. Snipers lurked in every building. Streets were rigged with explosives and landmines. Loyalists used schools, hospitals, and homes as firing positions. The siege of hell for weeks, Sirte endured a bombardment that turned the city into a moonscape of destruction. NTC forces pounded the city with rockets, mortars, and tank fire. NATO aircraft dropped bombs on command centers and weapon stockpiles. Inside this hell, Gaddafi lived like a hunted animal. He moved constantly between abandoned buildings and underground bunkers. His once mighty army had been reduced to fewer than 200 desperate men, mostly from his own tribe. The man who had once commanded fear across Africa was now a shadow of his former self. Witnesses later described him as gaunt, pale, and exhausted. His health deteriorated under the stress. High blood pressure, diabetes, and constant fear took their toll. By mid-October, the noose had tightened to a strangling grip. Sirte was completely surrounded. Block by block, building by building, rebel forces advanced through streets littered with bodies and debris. The final gambit on. October 19th. Faced with imminent capture, Gaddafi made his last desperate play. He would attempt to break out of Sirte under cover of darkness and flee south to the desert, where loyal tribes might still protect him. Just after 8 p.m., a convoy of over 50 vehicles began moving through Sirte's darkened streets. Pickup trucks mounted with machine guns, SUVs packed with guards, and supply vehicles carrying weapons crept through the ruins without headlights, but they were already doomed. High above, invisible in the night sky, American Predator drones had been watching every movement in Sirte for weeks. Heat-seeking cameras tracked the convoy as it headed for the western outskirts. The kill shot October 20th, 8:30 a.m. Death arrived from the sky. A Hellfire missile, launched from a Predator drone, screamed down and obliterated the lead vehicle of Gaddafi's convoy. The explosion sent bodies flying, and metal fragments ripping through the air like deadly rain. Minutes later, French Mirage fighter jets swooped down, dropping laser-guided bombs on the rear of the convoy. The precision strikes trapped the survivors in a corridor of fire and twisted metal. Dozens of loyalists died instantly. Gaddafi, bloodied but alive, stumbled from his destroyed vehicle and ran toward a concrete drainage pipe beside the road. Along with his son Mutassim and security chief Mansour Dao, he crawled into the 4-foot-wide pipe like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. A rat fleeing a sinking ship. The final Hunt Misrata fighters arrived at the scene within minutes. These weren't regular soldiers. They were men who had watched their families murdered by Gaddafi's war machine. They wanted blood, and they would have it. Following blood trails and footprints, they quickly discovered the drainage pipe. After throwing a grenade inside, they peered into the darkness and saw him, Muammar Gaddafi, the brother leader, cowering like a beaten dog. They dragged him into the harsh sunlight. Now he wore blood-soaked civilian clothes, his face a mask of dirt and terror. His left arm hung useless, his back was torn open, and his right leg could barely support his weight. The gathering crowd went wild with bloodlust. These were people who had suffered under his boot for decades, who had lost friends and family to his death squads. The last ride. They threw Gaddafi into the back of a pickup truck, like a sack of garbage. As the vehicle crawled through crowds of armed fighters, the violence began. Fists, rifle butts, sticks and stones rained down on the fallen dictator. Video footage captured these final moments. Gaddafi slumped over, blood streaming from his head and body, trying weakly to protect himself from the endless beating. The crowd screamed insults and curses. The exact moment of death remains shrouded in chaos. Medical examinations later revealed gunshot wounds to his head and abdomen. In the frenzy of violence and revenge, the truth died with him. The end of a monster by 1 p.m. on October 20th, 2011, at age 69, Muammar Gaddafi was dead. The man who had terrorized Libya for 42 years had met his end not in a palace or a courtroom, but bleeding in the back of a truck, surrounded by the very people he had oppressed. His body was taken to Misrata and displayed in a refrigerated meat locker for 3 days. On October 25th, under cover of darkness, Gaddafi was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Libyan desert. The location remains secret to this day. The man who once called himself the King of Kings of Africa died like a cornered animal, alone and despised. His empire of fear crumbled, his family scattered, and his name became synonymous with tyranny and brutality. The story of Gaddafi's last hours shows us that no dictator, no matter how powerful, is immune to the wrath of the people they oppress. If you want to see more untold stories of history's most brutal moments, make sure you're subscribed to History of and hit that notification bell. What do you think about Gaddafi's end? Was it justice or just revenge? Let me know in the comments below.